And with that, I will hand things over to Pam. Thank you. Pam, you're still muted.
No, you just try and plan for everything. Thanks again, Dan. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight. We will begin with our land acknowledgement. It is with gratitude and humility that we acknowledge that we are learning, speaking, and gathering on the ancestral homelands of the Mohican people, who are the indigenous people of this land. Despite tremendous hardship in being forced from here, today their community resides in Wisconsin and is known as the Stockbridge-Muncie community. We pay honor and respect to their ancestors, past and present, as we commit to building a more inclusive and equitable space for all. I'm happy to introduce our speaker tonight, who is also my husband, Roy Jacobson, better known as JR to most. He has worked in the Division of Fish and Wildlife for the New York State DEC for more than 30 years. He currently oversees statewide implementation of several habitat programs, including the Freshwater Wetlands Regulatory Program. JR has been working with colleagues in earnest since 2007 to make changes to the New York State Freshwater Wetlands Act. He is married to a wonderful and very tolerant wife, yours truly, and has two marvelous kids, Jake and Lilly, who adore him most of the time, but often roll their eyes. Welcome, JR.
Well, thank you, Pam. Rolling the eyes, the kids never roll their eyes.
No.
Not at me anyway. Well, welcome everybody. It's a great honor to be here. I know RPA is doing such great work, and when I was invited to give a talk on wetlands, it's a favorite topic I have, so I was jazzed to kind of come and chat with you tonight. Excuse me, Dan said we were going to try and do some polling. We'll try that out. The first slide that I have is a picture of somebody, the first poll question, and we can try that. Who is this famous singer? So Dan, I see the poll question up there, so people can start hitting that. Very exciting. I'm watching the poll numbers. You don't get to see them, but Dan and I do. It's pretty exciting. 94% are completed. So, Dan, did you want to end the poll? Or did you want me to? Or
I will end it. Just wanted to give people one last
Perfect.
chance, but it looks like most people have participated. So let's see the results.
And I have to say that this is I've given this talk several times before, and this is the best that I've ever gotten for who this actually is. Of course, it's Frank Sinatra. Most people know who he is. And so what I want to talk about is one of his songs. Young at Heart is one of his famous songs, and it starts out with the term "fairy tales can come true. It can happen to you." And then the next line is "if you're young at heart." But what I like to say, and it's really applicable to this talk tonight, is "if you work as a team." So the whole, this talk is going to be about the magical teamwork that went into doing a lot of good work on changing our Freshwater Wetlands Act and saving New York's freshwater wetlands. So a little overview of what I'm going to talk about tonight. I'm going to talk a little bit about what are wetlands. So those of you who don't know them, we'll briefly touch on that. I'll briefly touch on why they're important and protect them. A little bit about wetlands on the plateau. So those wetlands that are on the Rensselaer Plateau. Talk a little bit about the Freshwater Wetlands program in New York, some historic challenges that we've had in that program. And then I'm going to spend probably the most of the time talking about the changes that have come through and what I think is a cool and fascinating legislative story and some of the key provisions that are in that story. So first off, what is a wetland? This is one of my favorite definitions. It's fairly lengthy, but the idea that it is an area that has waterlogged soils or that's at or near the surface, and it really it promotes the growth of, plants that are adapted to that. We call them hydrophytes, hydrophytic vegetation, but it's really based on the types of plants that are growing there. So, there's a whole host of plants there. The wetland scientists have graded them from obligate or always in wetlands to upland plants that are always in uplands, and then a whole host of things in between. Here's several that are key species that we see quite a bit out there. But I'll just get into a little bit about wetland identification, and it's really just the practical side of it. This is easy. I don't think if someone looks at this area, they're all thinking, yeah, it's a wetland. It obviously has water. You walk out there, you're going to get your feet pretty wet. Other areas aren't quite as easy. Here's one that doesn't have any standing water, but it's got vegetation, in this case, skunk cabbage, that are always in wetlands. So it's clearly a wetland. Then there's spots that are difficult, such as this, it's a floodplain forest. And so you have a plant community that is a mix of things, and it really takes a good deal of expertise to figure out if this is a wetland or not. The other thing that we do as wetland scientists, we try to figure out where that wetland boundary is. So where the wetlands begin and the uplands end. And the scientists have used a 3-parameter approach. So they look at 3 things. One is the plants. I mentioned the plants before. In this case, to the left is tussock sedge, and to the right is silky dogwood. The second piece is evidence of hydrology. So this shows that there's water at least at the surface in this spot. So we have those 2 parameters, and the third parameter is the soil. So we really look at the soils, particularly when there's not water at or near the surface, and we can see based on the colors and the characteristics of those soils, is there a lack of oxygen? So, and i.e. lack of dominance of water in there. And we look at all those 3 parameters to determine where the wetland boundaries are. So all those things are real technical stuff, but that's how the experts look at it. Generally, there are several types of wetlands. One is an emergent marsh. These pintail ducks are in an emergent marsh, a common wetland out there. Forested wetlands, in this case, where there's trees in those wetlands, forested swamp. We have shrub swamps. You saw a picture of it before, but that's where those wetlands are dominated by shrubs versus trees. And then we have wet meadows. In this case, it's spike rush, but we have areas that have really low growing vegetation, all herbaceous, but are pretty on the drier end of wetlands. And then we have bogs and fens. Those are wetlands that have slow decomposition. There's a lot of material in this. Many cases there's sphagnum mosses, and all of that that organic matter builds up and creates what a lot of wetland scientists think are cool wetlands, bogs and fens. I'm not going to ask everybody who this is, because I know everyone knows John Legend, and it's really a question of why do we protect wetlands? From a guy like me, my standpoint, it's because they're cool, just like this guy. It was the coolest picture of John Legend I could find on the internet. But the real thing is that they're cool, but they're also provide many benefits to the people of the state of New York. And that's why we have a freshwater wetlands program, in fact. But the wetland benefits that we normally talk about are, flood and storm control. Many of you have probably heard that wetlands act like big sponges. And so they hold water on the landscape and slowly release that water so we can control flooding. Wildlife habitat. I'm a wildlife biologist by training, so that's kind of why I'm fully interested in wetlands. A habitat for a bog turtle or a spotted salamander or some birds and so forth, like the common yellowthroat there. Protection of subsurface water resources. So there's things under the water, protect those under the surface of the land where the water is there, protect that. Recreation, of course, there are neat places to hang out and recreate, maybe canoe. Go duck hunting. Pollution treatment, they act to cleanse the water that moves through them and hold sediments, also hold contaminants. They can control erosion. There are, of course, places where we can do education. We can also do scientific research. And they are open space and we can appreciate them. So, the why we regulate them is because they're cool, but they also provide benefits for all of us. I'll spend a few minutes here talking about wetlands on the Rensselaer Plateau. And so here's the next poll question. How many wetlands are on the Rensselaer Plateau? And there's 4 options there. So this one's a little different. We were getting a mix of answers here as opposed to everyone getting Frank Sinatra correct. And I appreciate folks participating here and giving your best guess.
There's 18 of 18 people.
And so we have a mix. It's pretty close to everything. One in each. The dominant was 8,900 acres in that second choice. So the true answer is all of the above, but let me explain why. So if we look at the state map wetlands, you have 3,800 acres on the Rensselaer Plateau. So here's a map of the plateau, and it actually shows the wetlands that are on our state regulated maps. If you look at the federal National Wetlands Inventory maps, that's where you get the 8,900 acres. And that shows more acres, but still 8,900. The third choice is if we look at wetland soils. So if we look at the soils that are the wetland soils on there, we get about 16,000 acres. So, the answer is all of the above, but it's really none of the above as well. Precisely, we do not know precisely how many wetlands are on the Rensselaer Plateau. We have some indications. It's probably not 16,000 acres, and it's probably more than the other two numbers. But we just don't know because it's really difficult in a mapping standpoint or from air photographs to determine exactly where wetlands are. There are also some special wetlands on the Rensselaer Plateau. And so there, the red dots are a few of these. We've got some neat bogs, we've got some fens and some swamps, and these are tracked by our New York Natural Heritage program. And, in the center of that, with those red dots, is the Post and Kill watershed, or the Post and Kill headwaters. And that's got a whole bunch of neat wetlands that are in there. So if you go on the Rensselaer Plateau, you do see some neat wetlands. And here's one actually on RPA's property at Post and Kill Community Forest. There's a dwarf shrub bog. And this was from this fall. Pam and I actually went there and did a little hiking. And that, those little white dots there, that's the seed pods of the cotton grass, which is an indicator species for the dwarf shrub bog. So a little bit about wetlands on RPA properties. There are about 540 acres that are state mapped. That's about 14% of all of the state mapped wetlands on the Rensselaer Plateau. There are about 1,100 acres of federally mapped wetlands, which are about 13% of the total that are on the Rensselaer Plateau. So the RPA lands have a good chunk of the wetlands that are on the plateau. Several properties have significant numbers of the COE properties. The West Mountain and Tower tracts have a lot of wetlands, and so does Post and Kill Community Forest. Those of you who do go to the Post and Kill, just like Pam and I did in the fall, you can go to Big Beaver Bog. It's on the Blue Trail, and you can have a really nice look at a wonderful wetland. There's a boardwalk there. It's a really nice spot to go to. So conserving wetlands. One way is to protect them. So we have, property, public and private ownership, and that's, publicly or privately owned. And here's sort of a look at all of the parklands, so public parklands. So we have the state parks, the DEC lands, our wildlife management area, as well as county properties, county parks. If you add the RPA lands, it's about 23% of the lands on the plateau are protected in public or not-for-profit ownership. The other way is through stewardship. So people can maintain their wetlands. They can create good buffers on them. Minimize mowing, minimize disturbance to those. So it's good stewardship. And then we also do regulatory work. What I like to say is we try to prevent people from doing stupid things like this. This is an actual huge excavator that got stuck. It's not on the plateau. It's actually in Staten Island. But somebody tried to go out there and, excavate in wetlands and then got stuck for it. So there was a certain amount of karma there. So the next question is, who regulates wetlands on the Rensselaer Plateau? Army Corps of Engineers, the DEC, the Environmental Protection Agency, or all of the above? I know this is kind of dead air because I'm looking at the responses here as they come in, so it's kind of cool to watch. But I keep forgetting that the participants don't get to see that. So now you can see the responses here. You know, most folks said it's all of the above, and a few people said it's DEC. Of course, everyone's right there because it is all of the above. DEC does regulate some of the wetlands, but not all of them. The Army Corps of Engineers regulates, co-regulates with the Environmental Protection Agency as well. So good job, everybody. So now I'm going to spend some time just talking a little bit about our Freshwater Wetlands Act and the Freshwater Wetlands Program here in New York. And it's Article 24 of the Environmental Conservation Law, and it was enacted in 1975. And so it does regulate those larger wetlands that are shown on our regulatory maps, those that are greater than 12.4 acres in size. So larger wetlands that are mapped. We can also regulate smaller wetlands that we use a term of art called unusual local importance. In this case, you know, it could, on the plateau, there is a wetland that houses or is habitat for the least bitterin, which is in the picture. So those wetlands can be regulated regardless of their size. And what's interesting, unlike the federal program, we have a regulated adjacent area. So there's a 100-foot zone around those wetlands that we regulate. And, you know, the intent of the adjacent area is to keep people away from the actual wetland. And in my mind, I think it does a better job at protecting those wetlands. Here's a map of all the state regulated wetlands across New York. I like to joke that there aren't any wetlands in the Adirondack Park. That's of course not true. There's a bunch of wetlands in the park, but the New York State DEC doesn't regulate them. It's the Adirondack Park Agency that regulates those in the park. So I said that we regulate the mapped wetlands. Here's an actual copy of the paper maps. Those are the official filed maps. This happens to be in Rensselaer County. It's it's in the Nassau area. And you can see the wetland there. The dark pen line there is the approximate wetland boundary. We name them. N is for the Nassau quadrangle. 28 is just the number. It doesn't mean any significance. And the part that I really want to point out is that is a house. So in our age of Google Maps and, you know, Google everything, we can look in and zoom into everyone's house and say what car's in the driveway. These maps were never designed to be that precise. This is the scale that was supposed to be. A house is a square little piece, a little speck on the map. We also classify our wetlands. We classify them on a scale from 1 to 4, 1 being the highest, having the most benefits, and 4 having fewer benefits. And the important part is that in order to do that, we had to go and visit every single one of those regulated wetlands. I'll come back to that later, but that's an important part. And we base that on the wetland type and where it is and some of the benefits that are there. Talk a little bit about permitting. This is actual a general permit that is actually issued now and being used today. But in its simplest form, we have a regulatory program that takes a 3-step process, and you can't go from one step to the next step until you've exhausted all the steps. So first you have to avoid. So if you have an opportunity to avoid, you need to stay out of the wetland, out of the 100-foot adjacent area. If you can't do that, then you have to minimize. So you need to try and get as far away from the wetlands as possible. And if you can't do that and you have to be in the wetland, then you have to talk about mitigation or compensating for those losses. Simple example, here's a wetland, 100-foot adjacent area, one house, you put a limited disturbance, you need a backyard, stay 100 feet away. You don't need a permit from us. That's what the law says you should do. If there's a road, say, that constrains the details of the site, well, then you might need to get a permit from us to, you know, have a modest backyard, and that we do issue a permit for that. So that'd be minimization. But there are situations where there's no alternative in the house. Other things have to be in the wetland. That's when we get into mitigation and compensation for those losses. Excuse me. And so what's wetland mitigation? It's not this, but there are guidelines that we have at the state level. There are guidelines for mitigation banks at the federal level. Part of those are also called inland fees. So there's a whole host of ways to mitigate it, whether it be on-site, off-site. But the intent is to mitigate for those losses of wetland benefits. Okay, so the next poll question. Who is this famous singer? Garth Brooks, Johnny Mathis, Alan Jackson, or Jim Bonesteel? I gave a similar talk last night at Siena College, and I was surprised how few people knew this answer. I can tell you right now that this group is a much sharper group than those college kids. %88 completed. And there we have it. So most people got it right. It's Alan Jackson. A few people were close with Garth Brooks. I'm not sure who picked Jim Bonesteel. I don't know if Jim Bonesteel actually on the line. Maybe he picked himself. But it's Alan Jackson. And the reason I bring this up is because he has a song called Here in the Real World. And I won't sing it for you because I can't sing. But the idea that, you know, I've given you all kind of the theoretical world of our wetlands program. Now I'm going to get into, you know, the real world, the not so perfect stuff. Our wetland maps stink. I've been working with them since 1988. My first job with the DEC was to work on classifying freshwater wetlands down on Long Island, but they stink. We estimate that we need to add about 1 million acres of wetlands just to make that 12.4 acre threshold. So we've missed 1 million acres. To put that into some context, we have 1.2 million on the maps now. So we basically have to double or close to double the amount of wetlands that are shown on the maps. The original mapping was done using old technology and old air photographs. You know, this GI from the Korean conflict was using pretty much the technology that was used to make the maps. Very subjective. They were drawn by hand. None of this Google Maps, none of the geographic information system, none of that. It's all done by hand. The width of the pen line alone is about 100 feet. So, you know, it was done as good as we can. Here's an example. This one happens to be from Lewis County. You can see in the upper left-hand corner of the picture, 1968. This is an actual photograph that was used to generate freshwater wetland maps. So if we zoom into one section there, you can kind of see the notes that the technician used to kind of figure out where the wetlands were or not. And that generated or led to freshwater wetland maps. So you can kind of see the pen lines there. It looks very similar to that map that I showed you of Nassau. But if we were to do it today, using today's technology, this is what we would come up with. So you can see a lot more wetlands there. There are connections to wetlands that we missed back in the 70s and 80s. And so using today's technology. The problem is two-tiered in my mind. First is completely unmapped. It's almost easier to deal with these because we missed them. In this case, this is one down in near Lebanon in Rensselaer County. 50-acre wetland, we completely missed it. I don't know why. I have no idea why. But we didn't regulate it until we did a map amendment a few years back. So, but you come across this, it should be regulated, but it's not. It wasn't shown on the maps. Easier to deal with. Excuse me. The more complicated or difficult ones are inaccurately mapped wetlands. So here's one in Dutchess County that I, back in the day, used to, when I did delineation work, I was out there and I was asked to delineate the wetland. And so I started hanging flags showing where that boundary is between upland and wetland. And I kept walking and, you know, it's roughly following the wetland, give or take. I get to this point and the engineer I'm with, he says to me, he says, Jared, not for nothing, but you are nowhere near the mapped wetland anymore. He says, I'm not arguing with it. It's as wet as can be. I mean, I'm an engineer. I don't know anything, but what happened? I said, I have no idea, but we eventually did a map amendment here. Okay. And we connected 3 separate wetlands and did all of that to do that. This is a real problem for us because first off, where do you draw the line? We're only supposed to regulate mapped wetlands. But where is this? This is a contiguous wetland. Do you do 100 feet away? Do you do 500 feet away? Do you do 1,000 feet away? All of those are in the middle of the wetland. And so this is really what I like to say causes me the biggest headaches and has been causing me a headache for many years. And the implications of these inaccurate maps, one, it causes confusion for us, but also for the regulated community. It's difficult for planning, so developers who want to plan ahead and figure out where the wetlands are or aren't, want to base that on maps. We don't have good maps. You know, it causes delays. And from my perspective, statutory goals are not met. So the goal was to protect all those larger wetlands and have them regulated, and we haven't been able to do that. Excuse me. The other problem is, in order to amend the maps, we have a process for amending the maps, but it's a huge paper tiger, and it requires individual landowner notice. So we have to send certified mailing to every landowner who could be affected. It needs to be published in local papers and all that kind of stuff. And when we've looked at that, we said it's going to be about $7.5 million just to do that process, to send all the mailings and to do those hearings and everything else required to amend the maps. So go through a few memories here. 1975. I mentioned that's when the Freshwater Wetland Act was enacted by the state legislature. In 1984, that was the first map that we actually produced. What we did was we worked around the state and we did county by county to produce final maps. 1984 was that first one. It's also the year I graduated high school. 1992 was our first map amendment. By then we realized that we still had errors in there that we needed to correct. And in 1992, we did our first map amendment. In 1995, we finished our last wetland map. That was down in Queens. And so it took us from 1975 to 1995 just to get the first set of maps all completed. In 2007, we realized that there's no way that we're going to get to that 1 million acres by doing one wetland at a time. We're going to need to take a watershed approach. And so we got some money from the Environmental Protection Agency, started to draft some maps. That took us to 2011. And from 2011 to 2019, we worked really hard to try and move maps, to try and get something done to protect more wetlands. Okay, now here's a quote. And you know that you fight harder for the lost causes than any others. And that's Jefferson Smith. So now we're going to have the next poll question. Who is Jefferson Smith? Is Jefferson Smith a mob informant in protective custody, the lead singer of Maroon 5, the man Pam Jacobson wished she married, or one of JR's idols? I'm really curious how this is going to go. About 60% completed. 70, 75, 80, 85. And so this is interesting to me. The right answer is one of JR's idols, but there are two people who thought that Pam should have married Jefferson Smith, and folks don't even know who Jefferson Smith is. Pam, I hope you weren't one of the two, but we'll talk about that later. Jefferson Smith is in my favorite movie. It was Jimmy Stewart's character in Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. It's my favorite movie. And it's really, if you've never watched it, it's a 1939 movie, black and white, just a wonderful story about somebody who goes into the Senate and is trying to fight the good fight. And he had that quote about, you fight harder for the lost causes. And so as I've been working through this wetland stuff, it's almost like it's a lost cause. I've been working for decades on this problem of trying to protect more wetlands. And in 2019, I don't know if my prayers were answered, but in 2019, the governor had proposed in the state budget as part of the Article 7 bills that get attached to the budget. They're talking about those bills right now, but in 2019, the governor had proposed something, and it's Part J, so remember this. And the real point of this proposal was to make map amendments cheaper. And what it did was, or attempted to do, was just make map amendments cheaper by, instead of certified mail, just send first-class mail. And this is going to save us millions of dollars. So this is the response. If you've ever if you ever looked at any of the documents for the budget, they're riveting. They're hundreds and hundreds of pages, but buried in one of those for this was Part J. And it says intentionally omitted. What that is, it's bureaucratic speak for sorry, JR, we're not going to do it. This is, we're not going to do this. And so intentionally omitted, not the nicest way to say sorry, JR, but that's the bureaucratic speak. So when that happened, I have to channel my inner Yoda who says, patience you must have. And then in 2020, there was another proposal, governor's proposal number 2. This time, Part TT, we were hoping instead of Part J, TT had better mojo, be able to move something on this. But this was drastically different. This wasn't keeping the same system. This was to make maps educational, not regulatory. So to break that link between those improperly mapped wetlands and what we regulate. So a big change here. Well, Part TT, intentionally omitted once again. In fairness, the pandemic was just starting when they were trying to negotiate this sort of thing. In fact, I was up on the Rensselaer Plateau and I was getting phone calls, hiking with family, as they were trying to negotiate some of this. So patience, I must have. And in 2021, this time, instead of the governor's proposal, there was a proposal in the Senate that took what the governor had done in 2020 and said, yeah, okay, let's make these maps educational and not regulatory. It did some other things, but it was an attempt to kind of move this along. And it was something that passed the Senate. It died in the Assembly, but it passed in the Senate. So once again, I want to patience I must have. And so then in 2022, a third proposal from the governor. This one's Part QQ. We're hoping for, better mojo. Spoiler alert, it actually passed. But so Part QQ. And the point here was to make maps educational, not regulatory, so it's still there. And this whole legislative stuff is not something I do every day. It's been fascinating to watch and be a part of. But I'm amazed at how many people it took working in unison to kind of move this. It actually is inspiring for me, and it also humbles me a great deal to be involved in that. And it was a true collaboration. Here's a binder that I bring everywhere now. It's the Article 24 Dream. The environmental groups that helped us on this always would joke with me saying, you still got your binder? You got your binder, right, JR? And so we had the governor's office, of course, working on this. Senate, Pete Harkiman, Senate. Assembly, Steve Engelbright and his staff. Environmental groups, Sierra Club, Audubon, over 90 environmental groups who are signed on to helping us with this. Of course, a whole bunch of people at DEC that I work with, and then other stakeholders were involved. And so in the budget, it was passed and it was signed into law, which then gave me a wonderful time to dance and keep dancing. By the way, I have to thank Lilly for taking those pictures of me. So major provisions of Part QQ. So let me walk through the major things that happened in Part QQ. In 2025, so we've got a little bit of time, the regulatory maps are gone. What we are required to do is create informational maps that have no connection to the extent of regulation. The acreage threshold. So the default acreage threshold of 12.4 acres is maintained until 2028. In 2028, it drops to 7.4. So we're going to be regulating even more than what we had done before in 2028. There are also provisions that allow us to regulate smaller wetlands. Instead of the term that we used before, unusual local importance, we're using the term unusual importance, and that allows us to regulate smaller wetlands regardless of size if they have one of 11 criteria. They meet one of 11 criteria, and I'll walk through those. First is it's in a watershed with significant flooding. So which makes perfect sense. If you're in an area that has repeated flooding, these wetlands on the landscape can really help slow down water and hold water on the landscape to prevent flooding. Urban areas. We've lost a lot of wetlands in our urban areas, and urban areas are the second one. Wetlands with rare plants, those should be, regardless of their size, protected. Wetlands that have, endangered and threatened species and species that are, at least rare on the landscape. Class 1 wetlands, remember I said that they're classified them from 1 to 4. Those criteria that are in the Class 1 characteristics, those highly beneficial wetlands, if they have those characteristics. Anything that we previously designated as a wetland of unusual importance, we don't want to lose those wetlands, so those are regulated. We also have to deal with vernal pools. Those of you who know vernal pools, I know Jeff had a thing, an amphibian walk last weekend, I believe, but Vernal pools make a lot of our tails wag. We're very excited about it. New York has been behind on protecting vernal pools, so this was an avenue to start working on that. Wetlands and floodways, so those are the active parts of the streams and rivers. They were previously mapped. Also, we have the opportunity to regulate those of local and regional significance. And then number 11 is significant for protecting states' water quality. If anybody's following what's happening at the federal level with the waters of the US rules, it's constantly in court. It's been flip-flopping back and forth. And so this was an intent to allow the state to fill some gaps and holes depending on where the federal government ends up and how they regulate wetlands. A few other major provisions that come in through in 2025. We have 90 days to actually do our jurisdictional determination. So we don't have maps now, or we won't in 2025. And so folks we have 90 days to tell folks, am I regulated or am I not? Or are they regulated or are they not? We also have a 5-year hold on those determinations. So, if a developer comes to us and says, am I regulated or not? We tell them no, they have 5 years, then they have to come back to us because wetlands can change. And this gives an opportunity to kind of be dynamic with that. Like I said, we have to produce informational maps from various sources, and we have to produce educational materials on our website, which is great because, quite frankly, we haven't done much of that. Oh, here's another poll question. And who is this famous singer? Is it Frank Sinatra? Is it Alan Jackson? Is it Dua Lipa? Or is it Mariah Carey? Now I can see as the numbers come in that we have a very smart group, a very, very smart group. When I did this to those college students, I was so disappointed. Now, Siena College kids are really smart, right? Probably even smarter than some other colleges, yet very few knew who Dua Lipa was. I was so disappointed. So yes, Dua Lipa is the correct answer. I was hoping no one would pick Frank Sinatra or Alan Jackson because, well, she doesn't look anything like that. But the point of bringing her up is she has a song called New Rules. And so the idea is that with all of these changes in the statute, we're going to need to do regulatory changes, and we're going to change the rules on how we regulate wetlands in New York. And so there's a large list of things that we have to do. I've kind of chunked them up into different steps, and I'll kind of walk through some of these. Outreach. We're going to need to do a lot of outreach, and we've hired actually a person to help us do that outreach. But we're going to do it initially, and we're doing that now before we actually start working on the regulations. But we're also going to do it throughout the course of this time, and then have outreach once we do have the rules done, so that people will know, the regulated community will know what we're doing. Those unusual importance criteria, we're going to need to work on some of those. We have 5 teams working on those various pieces of that to come up with the definitions, the things, so that folks know which wetlands of unusual importance are actually regulated. One of the examples, and some of those criteria are pretty simple. Others, like the vernal pool one, isn't quite as easy. This is the actual language from the statute. It says if it's a vernal pool that is known to be productive for amphibian breeding, right? So it's got to be known, so we have to know where it is. We also have to determine how is it productive. And both of those questions we have folks working on now. New York Natural Heritage had done some work on how productive certain vernal pools are. They're helping us with that. But we're going to have to come up with regulatory language to say, okay, here's the ones that are productive and known. So it's a big task for us. We also have to totally redo our classification system. The classification system was based on visiting each and every wetland. We can't do that anymore. So we're going to have to do it remotely. So we're going to be totally changing how we classify wetlands. We're still going to do class from 1 to 4, but we're going to have to come up with a totally different system on doing that. Informational maps, we're actually working with smart folks at Cornell University. We have an agreement with them. They're helping us to develop maps for the whole state that covers all the wetlands for educational purposes. So not just our 12.4 acres or 7.4, it goes all the way down to an acre and probably smaller than that. And so our agreement with them is that they're going to produce maps, and we'll have maps in October of 2024. We also have a whole bunch of work dealing with internal workflow. We're going to just to be able to move it and be able to handle all the permitting. We're going to need to use general permits. We're going to need to come up with protocols, standard operating procedures, a whole bunch of work in there to be able to implement this. And all of that will lead to a formal rulemaking process. And so it's a public process that requires us to do a whole bunch of work, and which includes public comment periods and all that. So here's my Gantt chart, my timeline. Nobody's supposed to be able to read this, mostly because I don't want folks holding me to the exact timeline. But there's outreach that's going to be between now and 2025. We have, like I said, a bunch of teams kind of working on unusual importance criteria and how that works. We have another team that's working on the classification. We also have the mapping. Remember, I said that was going to span the whole time. And then we have this large category with a whole bunch of different tasks within that for rulemaking. And the important part here is that we need to have, we need to be moving the rulemaking early this summer. And that's all done so that we can have 2 rounds of public comment. What drives me nuts is when the government says, yes, we want your comment, but we really can't incorporate your comment because we don't have enough time. Our State Administrative Procedures Act requires us to put out proposals, which is great. And if we make significant amendments, we need to put it out for public comment again. So what we're anticipating is that we'll put this initial proposal out, we'll get a whole bunch of comments, and then we'll amend it and improve it based on those public comments. And if you backdate all of that, we have to get, on and get it moving quickly. So with that, I'll say thank you for listening to me babble on about my favorite topic, and I'd be happy to take and answer questions. Well, I'll take questions. Let's try and answer them.
We do have a couple questions in the chat. So one that just came in right now. Can you integrate bed and banks regulations and wetland regulations?
You mean like mitigation banks? Is that what it says, or Pam? Sorry.
It doesn't say that, but
because that's,
I think that's what, yeah.
Yeah, it kind of makes sense. The mitigation banking, in New York, for us, we have some pretty restrictive regulations that make it difficult to use mitigation banks. The federal government uses those all the time, and we've had, it's on our list of things to incorporate. This proposal won't have it because that change would have to be in another set of regulations. The regulations that we're going to change are our mapping and classification regs. So it's a good comment. It's one that we are going to be working on, but I have enough on my list now. We won't be working on that yet.
All right. We also have another question with a lot of little questions, so we'll break it down. Can you speak to the different criteria for state versus federal wetlands?
There are different definitions. So the state definition up until 2025 said it has to be greater than 12.4 acres, mapped, those kinds of things. The federal side says that they have to be waters of the US. And that's kind of where I alluded to the regulatory and legal nightmare that is the definition of what's regulated under the Clean Water Act. Right now, there's a court case working through, actually at the Supreme Court. We're anticipating that there'll be a decision this summer. It's called the Sackett case, to really better define what's regulated and what's not regulated under the Clean Water Act. So those are the major differences in how we look at them. If we co-regulate it, so if it's the same wetland we're regulating, we do a lot of that. The definitions and how we do delineations and determine the wetland boundaries are pretty similar. So if the both feds and the state regulate both, it's pretty similar.
Well, that's exactly the next question. How do the agencies work together towards the same goal of protecting or not protecting?
Yeah, if anyone saw, Melissa Tony's and Andy Dangler's talk a few months ago, we don't work with them at all. Okay, that was a joke. We work with them very closely. We try actually to work with them on larger projects and on smaller projects to make sure that we give a similar answer. But there are times where their regulations and what they actually regulate is different from what the state does. You know, in the case of the feds, they regulate excavation and fill. They don't really regulate vegetative cutting. We do regulate vegetative cutting in our statute. We also have a 100-foot adjacent area. The federal wetlands do not. They just regulate the wetland themselves.
How does New York regulate when compared to other states with comparable amounts of wetlands?
Well, I might be a little biased, but I think we do everything better in New York than anywhere else. I think, you know, with our state, you know, Article 24, I think that 100-foot adjacent area is uncommon with other states in what they do. Some states just regulate what the feds do and just use the federal program to regulate their wetlands. Other states like New York have their own state statutes. You know, ours is pretty restrictive, but probably not the most restrictive. You know, a state like Washington State is, you know, they do regulate a lot more, not a lot more than us, but they do regulate more than we do. And so, you know, it varies from state to state, but we do a pretty good job at doing that.
So far, the last question is, how will I know if use of my 5-acre wetland is regulated? Total property is 6 acres.
Yeah, it's a good question. You know, right now, if it's shown on our maps, it's, you know, or it's close to something that we show on our maps, then it could be regulated. And it's not, it's the total size of the wetland itself, not just what's on someone's property. So come 2025, what folks will have to do is come to us and say, okay, is this property regulated or not? And then what our folks will do, and we hired 3 people who started a few months ago, we'll look at all the air photographs and the educational maps. We'll look at the soils. We'll look at, you know, the elevations that are there, and then make a determination whether that 5-acre or 6-acre, you know, wetland is part of a larger wetland. And if it is, then it'll be regulated as by the default if it's greater than 12.4. They'll also look to say, okay, does it meet one of the set 11 criteria? And like I said, we're working on getting the details and being transparent about what we regulate, but our folks will then look at that and say, is this one of the smaller wetlands that we regulate? And then we'll give a formal letter and say, yeah, this your property, or your property has regulated wetlands on it. And then we can also go out and do delineations and show the boundaries and that sort of thing.
JR, sorry to interject, but Jeff Briggs, who asked the question earlier, can you integrate bed and banks regulation and wetland regulation? He added a little more to clarify. He says, I refer to stream bed and bank regulations, stream bed and stream bank regulations.
Yeah, and where the feds, that's a good question, but the feds, you know, waters of the US include both streams and wetlands. New York State has sort of separated those, and we have 2 separate sets of laws and regulations that deal with streams and also deal with wetlands. You know, in order, the critical piece for our State Wetlands Act is that it's vegetated. And so if you have a stream that, even if it has a better bank, that is vegetated, so it has wetland plants in it, then we would include that as part of our wetland. So I don't know, Jeff can probably unmute if he's got wants to continue on, but you know, the idea that we do regulate those, but they're under separate statutes.
Yeah, my problem is the confusion that we run into with people finding that their wetland is not regulated by DEC. So they say, oh boy, it's not regulated, but it really is regulated by the Corps. And you want to put in a bridge over a stream, well, you still got to get a permit. This is separate. And the guy who comes out to do the delineation from DEC is also the guy that looks at bed and banks for regulating bridges over streams. So there's these confusions that that come up because we have separate regulations and they aren't connected in the people's minds. And so they end up doing things that they shouldn't because they think that it's okay because they're not regulated.
Yeah, and we need to do a better job at, letting folks know when we regulate something and when the Corps of Engineers could regulate it as well. And we've been working and we've been making baby steps towards, being more integrated between us and the Corps of Engineers. The example that I like to use is we're dangerously close to issuing a state programmatic general permit, which is a joint permit with the Corps and DEC for after storm events. So we have, so after like Irene and Lee, when the streams are torn up and people need to, fix their infrastructure and do things, it's been in the past that each agency would do their own thing. And we all said that's insane. And so this state programmatic general permit, SPGP, is an effort to then do it together. And so that if, say, the Corps goes out to a site, they're issuing a permit for the Corps and for us. If we go to the site first, we issue it for us and the Corps. And that was sort of our first foray into that world, because in that sense, right after a storm, we need to get these permits through. There's not that much difference between our protocols from the Corps. As we get further away from those storm events, that's where we get into a little bit more back and forth, because our regulatory jurisdiction it can be a lot different. So we're working on it. It's a good comment, but we're working on it.
There's another question. How many people in DEC are working specifically on wetland protection?
Yes, well, we have about there's about 40 people who work on stream and wetland protection. And it's hard to tell exactly because most people do both together. But, like I said, we've got 40 people working on that now. When we talk about full-time equivalents, FTEs, anyone who does management, it's about 15 FTEs per year working across the state.
One more question. What are some more specific criteria that differentiate between wetland class levels? Can you give some examples of class levels for RPA property wetlands?
Well, RPA property wetlands, I can't do. I don't know those wetlands well enough. I can talk about generally what the classification system is. So class 1 wetlands, the primary one that we use is endangered and threatened species. And one of those, like I said, is the least bitter, and that's actually not on RPA property. It happens to be on the wildlife management area, but it's on the plateau. Other endangered and threatened animal species can make a class 1 wetland. There's also other criteria like, could it be, if it was lost, could it inflict flooding on a largely developed area or a less developed area. So those are kind of the criteria. Another class 1 is a classic kettle hole bog. So the regulations are, well, I don't know how many pages it is. So there's a lot of different criteria in there. There's also, if you have 4 class 2 characteristics, then it bumps you up to a class 1. So, a lot of our places have, let me go back. Most of our wetlands are probably class 2 or 3. There are very few class 4s, and there are modest amounts of class 1s.
All right. If you have any more questions, you can still put it in the chat, but we're about to 8 o'clock. So thank you very much, JR. There's also a lot of thank yous in the chats as well. Great talk, etc. So thanks for being here, everyone.
Thank you. Truly a pleasure.
Thanks, everyone. We'll see you next time. Have a great night.